Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Stone Chapel Podcast. I'm David Capes. Andrew Perrin is with us to talk about his new book, Lost Words and Forgotten Worlds, Rediscovering the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's a scroll scholar teaching at Athabasca University in Alberta, Canada. The Stone Chapel Podcast comes to you today courtesy of the Lanier Theological Library and Learning Center. It's part of the Church Leaders podcast network. Many books on the Dead Sea Scrolls are technical and hard to read. Perrin's book is written for people that know little or maybe even nothing about the scrolls, but it's also a book experts are going to want to know and to discuss. It's a beautiful book, well written, timely. We're almost 80 years, it's hard to believe, since the first cave was discovered and its contents revealed to the world. The scrolls found in the Judean desert are part of an extensive Jewish library from the centuries before and during the time when Jesus, John the Baptizer, Peter, and Paul were living and flourishing. So stay tuned. There's a lot to talk about today with Andrew Perrin on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
My name is Andrew Perrin, and I'm Professor of Humanities at Athabasca University.
Dr. Andrew Perrin, welcome back to the Stone Chapel Podcast. Your second time to be with us.
Second time, and hopefully not the last time. I love being back, and good to connect with you always in person and even virtually. So glad to be here today. Thanks for having me back.
Now, today, your book, it's a fine book. I've been reading it the last couple of weeks. I love the way you've done the chapters. It reads well. A lot of books about the Dead Sea Scrolls, to be frank, are a little bit technical, and they're a little bit scary for people that don't know it.
Yeah.
It's a good book for scholars, but it's also a good book for students as well. And I don't know if that's who you had in mind. So let's ask this at the very beginning. What's the big idea behind this particular book?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear it was kind of landing in those spaces where you felt a bit like you could read it as a scholar and also like a student and not have too many barriers. The big idea from this book is, the Dead Sea Scrolls are ancient texts, but they only turned up in our modern world like 75 years ago. That's very recent history.
Yeah.
And it's taken decades to publish them, to understand what the texts say. Now we're asking, what do these texts mean? What's their impact? What are their implications? And a lot is changing because scrolls research is ongoing. So this book is meant to be an invitation, hopefully like a low barrier invitation into this exciting world of the scrolls, looking at them as texts, but also I talk a lot about their context for how we think about these writings as they relate to scribal culture, ancient Jewish thought, identity, and practice, even the early Christian movement, writings in the New Testament, biblical texts. The scrolls are really brought into conversation with so many different areas. And frankly, as a student and still student of the scrolls myself, it was hard to kind of cut myself off to go, I thought, this is enough topic. It could keep going. So I tried to find, a dozen or so big bucket kind of topics that make this book a great introduction into this exciting world of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
When we think about the scrolls, a lot of folks don't know that the scrolls were found in the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah.
And as you said, it took decades and decades for these things. Why did it take so long for these to get published?
It wasn't until the kind of mid-90s where the scrolls were, fully available and published in their original languages, then in translation. Part of the reason is that it's long, arduous work. That's a big part of this reason, actually. You look back on articles and essays and news coverage even, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and people are angry, where are the scrolls? Where are the scrolls? Haven't they been published? You get conspiracy theories about this. The biggest majority is this is all scholars all over the world. They're doing this as part of a teaching research job. They got families. There's all sorts of things going on geopolitically in the world in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Absolutely, yeah.
You can't publish 1,000 manuscripts overnight. So we got to go easy on folks that were doing that work. At the same time, I think there was some ongoing angst around, well, is there something that's being hidden, covered up? And that's where you get kind of some exciting conspiracy theories. But
It's all the
we're in
Vatican. The Vatican is
oh
holding
yeah,
on
of
to
course,
something, and something
yeah,
here in the Dead Sea Scrolls disproves the Christian faith according
yes,
to these
yes.
conspiracy theories.
Yes, that kind of gave rise to popular imagination, but we're in the really fortunate position today. The scrolls are fully published. You can find them in English translations, and even more than that, you can go online and look at digital images from the comfort of your couch and see the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, for all the reasons that may or may not have, helped publishing, years and years in the making, we're in like the golden age right now because we can read the texts, we can see the texts, and hopefully we have books like mine to help you kind of find your way through them.
A lot of these scrolls, Andy, are not intact. It's not like you've got 1,000 intact scrolls where you can read every line. A lot of them are very fragmentary, are very small, they're partial, and there's some conjecture that goes on in terms of trying to reconstruct the text that's there.
Yes. Yes. You're absolutely right. I somewhat tongue in cheek in the book say, most of these aren't Dead Sea Scrolls, they're closer to Dead Sea scraps. And I'm not saying that meaning they're worthless. I mean, that's just the material reality. You got to imagine, the largest scrolls we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls are the Temple Scroll, which is, I think 8.2 meters long, and then the Isaiah Scroll is about 7.5 meters long. Again, I'll get the exact figures wrong, I'm sure, but they're in that ballpark. Those are great exemplars of what a scroll would have looked like, perhaps. But most of them are, puzzle pieces of those pictures now that we have. So to reconstruct a text is challenging. Imagine doing a puzzle without having all the pieces and not knowing what the picture on the front of the box was. Are you reconstructing a blue sky or a blue ocean? You might not know. There are methods and approaches to do this in the scrolls, but there's always a balance between deep analytical, critical, scientific work and kind of the art of interpretation that goes along with that. But that's why doing this with other colleagues that are around the world working on this, we can kind of pressure test our ideas and have we reconstructed the best thing, or are we going off in a direction that doesn't make a lot of sense? When it comes to writings that we also knew about, like texts in the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament, often we'll look to the Septuagint or the Masoretic text to go, well, we're missing this gap in, say, in a Jeremiah scroll. What are other Jeremiah manuscripts doing now? And that's not to say you can kind of copy and paste, but it does give us some guidelines. So there's principles for doing it better and worse. If you love puzzles, then the scrolls are for you. If you do not, then please do not study the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Don't take them on vacation with you and try to sit around the fire and reconstruct the puzzle.
Yeah, you've got to have a real curiosity and openness to study the scrolls, because sometimes you might not actually know what you're missing.
The other thing, too, is that these scrolls are written in Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek from that period. It's not just anybody in the world that can pick these things up and start looking at them. I mean, we can do it in translation, obviously, but we can't do the originals.
Yeah, and that's it. It's an exciting thing to kind of dive into, because even folks that might be listening that are going, well, I know some Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. That's awesome. Like, keep going on that journey, because it opens up all sorts of places you can go, like reading scrolls. But even there, I remember when I went from learning biblical Hebrew to diving into Qumran Hebrew, all of a sudden the crutches of your vowel points are gone. You don't have all these things these rules that I thought I knew kind of dissolved. And like the English language, language changes over time. So Qumran Hebrew is not necessarily the same as biblical Hebrew, is not necessarily the same as rabbinic Hebrew. So there's always some growing pains that go with it. But the payoff is to be able to recover something, encounter an idea, appreciate a context, and seeing that in a physical scroll of Qumran that you can kind of digitally or even in person kind of pick up and feel if you're in a museum. That's a really rewarding experience that I don't think really any other area of biblical studies has. We have texts that we can actually encounter and really work closely with from that ancient of a time.
As you begin to open the book up, you say, now, these are the best English translations. If you can't read the scrolls in Hebrew, which would be the best thing, go out and get this English translation, because it's a good translation. And say the same thing in the translation of the Septuagint. Because for those of us who dabble in these things, we work in these areas, those are the go-to resources too very often. So you're giving them good advice on books that you and I use and others use who work in the scrolls on a regular basis.
Yeah, we're familiar with all sorts of different English Bible translations. There's any number of translations, but it can be tougher to find things like this are a little bit off the beaten path. So if folks are looking to read scrolls themselves in translation, I hope it's okay. I'll give a shameless plug for two books that are not my own, but were some of my own mentors and teachers. The Dead Sea Scrolls Bible by
Yes.
Gene Ulrich and Peter Flint and Marty Abegg, who are my teachers in the scrolls. Fantastic resource. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, a new translation by Wise, Abegg, and Cook. If you want to be able to read just about everything in the scrolls in an accessible way, in translation, with some great introductions and footnotes, you can't beat those two volumes. They'd be money well spent, and I'm sure books that are well worn by the time you're done with them.
The editio princeps, the official sort of major editions,
Yes.
those are very expensive. It's not like you're going to find those in every library. But what you've just described now, and we'll put some things in the show notes about that, will help people find the originals. But they're fascinating to read because they come from a culture that is roughly the same time as Jesus and John the Baptist and Paul and the early Christians. Some of them are earlier, many of them are earlier than that period of time, but it's still
Yes.
a central culture of what Jews and Judaism was like in those days.
Yes, and that's kind of one of the big ideas in this book, and I have a few chapters later on in the book that get directly at this. And there's some of the things I'm most excited about thinking about these days is how do we think about Christian origins as it grew up and that movement grew out of Second Temple period Judaism? That when we hear similarities or echoes maybe between the Qumran text and the New Testament, there's many of them, and that's because these are the early Christians, Jesus, Paul, and their followers are largely coming from that Second Temple period context in Judea. Now, Jesus and John the Baptist or Paul, they were not Essenes. They were unlikely to have been at Qumran. But, you and I right now are thousands of miles apart. We probably share a lot of cultural common fabric just by virtue of us being in the same broad culture. That makes sense to you and I today, living today. But imagine looking back a few thousand years and going, what does Paul mean when he says that? Or what is Jesus trying to get at when he uses that phrase?
Right.
Sometimes hearing around the New Testament from different ideas, writers, and expressions in the culture can actually help us hear it differently, or maybe even the way it was meant to be heard in the first place. So one of the big ideas in this book is not just engaging the scrolls in their own right, which is exciting, but then going, what if we put our foot in the camp of kind of the early Jesus movement and have our ears open to the New Testament now with this new knowledge? Does it challenge what we thought before? Does it confirm what we thought before? Does it change our reading of the text? And sometimes it does, and it can help us add value in some unexpected ways.
Yeah. Well, it's a terrific book. We're talking with Andrew Perrin about his book, Lost Words and Forgotten Worlds, Rediscovering the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the scrolls are truly a library of books. It's not just a book, or it's not just a Bible.
That's right.
It's a lot of different kinds of things, isn't it?
Yes, the scrolls is a collection. We have about 930 fragmentary texts, so give or take, depending on how you count puzzle pieces. Like you said, they're in Hebrew, in Aramaic, and in Greek. Among this collection, we have texts that include materials of almost all of the books that later show up in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, everything except for Esther, as far as we know. So they're incredibly important for text criticism and understanding kind of the shapes of Scripture before the canon. As well as we have writings that are sectarian writings. I think I mentioned the Essenes earlier. This community at Qumran seemed to be a scribal community that was part of an Essene movement. And they had a lot of writings that outlined their practices, their structure, their liturgy, their expectations. And those materials give us insight into a very unique and distinct social, scribal context for a Second Temple period Jewish community. Also in the scrolls, we have copies of writings of books that we already knew about but didn't have ancient copies of, like the Book of Tobit or Aramaic Levi document, for example. We knew about those writings from other traditions, maybe like the Cairo-Geniza or the Septuagint, but we didn't know how far back they went, and these have some of our earliest manuscripts of those texts. And then probably some of the coolest stuff in the scrolls, at least for my money, is stuff we didn't even know about before. Texts that we didn't even know existed. Something like the Genesis Apocryphon, or liturgical text or apocalyptic text. The Hodayot, for example, is a beautiful and complex poetic and liturgical text.
That's all
These are
about
writings we had
really
no
praise,
idea.
right? Praising God.
Absolutely.
A lot of psalm-like text, giving thanks to God and such.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
and these are the things that we all of a sudden we have not just a fresh context for studying, but in this case, quite literally new texts that are actually very ancient. And that's kind of a cool dynamic when you open up the scrolls, you can see all those things in that library, like you said.
Is there a book that you sort of gravitate toward more than any of the other books? You sort of lit up when you started talking about some of these books that we didn't know about. You sort of
Yeah.
lit up.
Yeah, for sure. I spend most of my research in the Aramaic texts at Qumran, and that's about 10 to 13% of the collections in Aramaic. So not a huge slice of the pie, but a small enough one. And I love these texts because they kind of have the vibe often like the book of Daniel. So I work a lot in Daniel, in the kind of Hebrew Bible Old Testament space. But writings like the Genesis Apocryphon, if you're going to go read one of these, ancient Aramaic texts that we didn't know about, go read the Genesis Apocryphon. It is a rewritten, retold, reimagined interpretation of some of these classic stories we know, but it's threading them with, new ideas and interpretations, and it's a great read. And these Aramaic texts, they're interesting, they're sophisticated, and quite often they're just fun to read because you're watching scribes create and interpret while they're trying to honor tradition, and they're holding all those things together. It's really interesting.
Last night I was teaching at a church, and we were looking at Matthew chapter 3, and that's introduced with the story of John the Baptist. And there's a verse associated with John the Baptist that is from the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah 40, verse 3, a voice calling in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his path. We see that in the Gospels in association very closely with John, but this is also a important text understood differently by the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least wrote some of them.
Yes, when we look at Matthew is a great example because Matthew, it seems like every 3 verses he's quoting the Old Testament, as the prophet said, and just so this is all connected, right? Yeah, he's not the only one doing that in this period. There are other Jewish groups like the Qumranites being one of them, where they're looking at their ancestral scriptural traditions, going, we think that matters. We think that it said something. Now, what does it mean for us and who we are today? And Isaiah 40, verse 3 gets quoted and used as a way of interpreting the community of Qumran's kind of orientation to finding their way in the wilderness, in their case, quite literally. It's a different interpretation than Matthew, because Matthew's obviously, like we said, trying to understand kind of the arc and the trajectory towards Jesus, whereas the Qumranites are trying to trace their own arc and trajectory. We don't have to agree with either one of those readings to see that what's interesting is that people in this period are trying to make sense of that scriptural tradition and connect it to their world back then, their present day. I find that very relatable all of a sudden, because that's kind of what I think many of us are still trying to do. So when we look at Qumran and we look at the New Testament or even other writers of this period, it's really interesting. My ears perk up when I go, I've heard someone else try to interpret this text. What are they doing with it, and how is it different? And that kind of can help us understand some of the conversation that we were not privy to, because we're not, Jews living in the first century.
Yeah.
But we can kind of hear some of their ideas new.
You have this culture that's there, and it's produced this wonderful volume of texts that give us an insight into the mind and the hearts and the values of these people. It's really a unique kind of archaeological find, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, and this is one of the advantages and challenges at the same time of doing Dead Sea Scrolls, because the advantage is we have, like I said, thousands of fragments, hundreds of fragmentary scrolls found in caves in dotting kind of the northwest shores of the Dead Sea, from around Masada to the south to the kind of corner of the Dead Sea in the north, about 11 caves. And those texts on their own are great reads and challenging to interpret. And they're found in quite close proximity to this archaeological site known as Qumran, which seems to be the site of a Jewish community of Essenes that penned or preserved some of the scrolls. So on the one hand, we have texts, and on the other hand, we have archaeology. And one of the kind of things that's challenging there, and I have a chapter on this in the book, is how do you make sense of the rocks and the rubble on their own without kind of reading the text onto them? And how do you make sense of the text without overly informing our read of them with the archaeology? But then how do you do that well together? Because this is a real opportunity, even if it's a challenge. We see things like in the scrolls, this community really prized ritual purity. And how they maintained ritual purity, not out of some sort of trite fundamentalism, but expressed their belief in a God through purity practices every day. Then we look at Qumran, and they have out in the desert waterways that are filling cisterns of water that have steps in them for ritual purity. That's a great example of how we can try and read the scrolls for what they are trying to articulate about purity, then looking at archaeology and trying to see like life on the ground. What did this look like? And it's that both and that's not always easy, but it can be really worthwhile if we're trying to get a sense of the bigger picture from both of those data points.
I'll ask you to put on your prognostication hat. Are there more scrolls yet to be found in the desert, you think?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's Jerome, if I'm not mistaken, who nods that, we're aware there's some caves out there. And that's 4th century.
Fourth century, yeah.
And after the scrolls were first found, some of the scrolls in 1947, then it took years of, the Bedouin folk were out doing this, archaeologists, scholars, the Israeli military, had all these different kind of attempts to try and find more caves. I don't know at this point if there are more scrolls associated with these in caves because it's been so well combed over, but I hope so. Having said that, when I look at the publication of the scrolls, yes, they're all available, but the amount of text in the scrolls that 75 years after they've been discovered and decades after they've been published that have not been closely looked at is huge. So in a way, the discoveries are right here. I'm far more interested in the scrolls we have and making sense of them first before I worry about going back and trying to find some more in caves. But since the question was, are there more out there? I kind of feel like it's like, is there life on other planets? Well, I don't know. Maybe there's a part of me that goes, I hope so. That sounds cool.
It does. Yeah. And we don't know, but you're right. It takes a long time for scholarship to come around to describe these, to compare these, to look at the archaeology over against, and just because they come to a firm conclusion today doesn't mean that will be the same conclusion in days ahead, because new data could be discovered. We're grateful for this book. It's called Lost Words and Forgotten Worlds, Rediscovering the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dr. Andrew Perrin, thanks for being with us today on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Stand by for a nugget of wisdom from Dr. Andrew Perrin. It's good to have Andrew Perrin back today on the Stone Chapel Podcast. I predict he'll be back again. If you want to study the scrolls, one of the best places in North America is the Lanier Theological Library and Learning Center. We have the primary text, we have the images, nearly all of the secondary literature. Take a look at our website and schedule a time at the library to get some research time in on the scrolls. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our intro and exit music. Thanks to Kathy Capes for her role in editing the podcast. Thanks to Jessica Mauser, Jana Firestone for helping us produce this podcast with the Church Leaders Podcast Network. Until next time, thanks for listening.
Readers of the New Testament Gospels and readers of the New Testament might hear some echoes when they hear folks like Matthew and some of the community texts describe themselves as the way. It's because both of these communities were interpreting Isaiah 40 verse 3 as a self-understanding for how they realized their position in the world and what their ancestral past was saying to their time today. So my nugget of wisdom is, it's interesting that the early Christians and the Qumranites didn't call themselves the destination or the ones that had it all figured out. They understood themselves as being on the way. My best advice is stay on the way. Your journey of faith, be it intellectually, personally, whatever that looks like, is meant to be a journey. None of these communities call themselves the destination, so stay on the way.